got it. Let me see if I can move so that
Yeah.
here it is. Hang on a sec. There. Is that better?
Yeah, that's great.
Okay.
So this podcast. I don't know how familiar you are with the Center for Food Safety.
Not as familiar as I should be.
No problem. This is life. So Center for Food Safety is primarily a public interest litigation shop that works at the
Yeah.
intersection of ag and the environment.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Most of our cases are under ESA or clean air or clean water, and we do a lot of suing the EPA for failure to do their job.
Yeah. Yes. And I
Um,
have seen you doing that. That much I know.
okay. And we're about to celebrate our 25th anniversary.
Awesome.
And our executive director, Andrew Kimbrell, charged me with the responsibility of helping to bring our communications into the 2022s. Right
And
now,
you're a communications person and also an attorney or not an attorney?
I'm not an attorney. I have a PhD in political science, and I sort of cut my teeth as a lobbyist,
Mm.
but dropped out of lobbying for just work-life balance issues. And CFS's sort of most forward-thinking comms outside of social media was like a blog that was updated, every 6 months. So
Right.
I took the challenge and sat with it for a little bit. And I thought, well, what would I want to listen to? Because I actually don't want to listen to blogs that like dig into the EPA's.
Yeah.
But what did interest me is like, how the fuck are we all still in this work? And like, how are people sticking to it? Why did they get into it? What's their what's the tool, what's the weapon they're wielding? And I think you in particular, and like thinking about the role of journalism and social change, sits pretty dear to my heart, because in my work as a lobbyist and an activist, if it wasn't for independent investigative journalists, I wouldn't have been able to do what I did. And I look
Love
at
to hear
this
that.
moment and I think to myself, unless we fix our media landscape, this is all just going to get worse. Like I look at Fox News and there is nary a mention of the January 6th hearings. Meanwhile,
Right.
the New York Times is live tweeting it every 30 seconds. So we live in this really depraved informational landscape.
Yeah.
That's where I want to start, is kind of how you got into journalism. And I'm curious, like, have you always been a writer? Have you always been a researcher? Was there like a particular story that like set your soul on fire?
Um, I don't think I've always been a writer. I haven't been. I mean, we all grew up writing, right? I didn't, professionally, I started out working for the Gay Men's Health Crisis um, in the early 90s. So it was
Wow.
just the beginnings of the AIDS crisis. And when I had been in college, I had done some sort of activism, and I was aware of this. And I just found myself, I was like an assistant in the policy department of GMHC. And it was super interesting and upsetting and scary. I kept seeing people die. And I didn't really know much about how kind of decisions were made about important things. And so I was watching that, just as a young person. And um, I don't remember how or why I felt inclined to like write stuff, to about it. And at first, it was just for kind of little free publications, and I just kept doing that. Eventually, I worked for a, a journal that doesn't exist anymore, and it was sort of like a political magazine called the Health Pack Bulletin, and it was about the healthcare politics of New York City, and it was begun by kind of radicals from the 60s. Uh, it's beginning to rain and thunder here. Do you hear that? And do you care?
A little bit, but it's nice. It's calming.
Okay. Um, I'm just trying to think of the
Where are
names.
you zooming in from?
Brooklyn.
Okay. I'm in
It
DC
was
right
like,
now. Normally I'm in Hawaii.
uh, so there was like Barbara and John Ehrenreich and all these kind of folks who were really focused on equity and racial injustices and that kind of thing. And that was super interesting to be close up into this network of activists who are really smart and trying to change things. And it was my job to kind of like put this little magazine together, which was dying when I came on and dead shortly after. But it kind of gave me this sense of how it's not that hard to like go from having a thought to like putting it out there, you know. And
Even back then, pre-Twitter.
yeah, yeah. You know, we were doing like I was laying it out using, the new page, whatever it was, the software that let you make magazines. It was really fun, actually. Um, and so I guess, and at that point, so it got me just thinking about like, yeah, you can have an opinion and you can weigh in, and like, there is no reason, I shouldn't be among those people weighing in when and so I guess that's kind of how I started. Eventually, I was at the Village Voice covering health, and that was fun. And then I did some radio stuff. I didn't do environmental reporting for quite a while. I think that my first real, well, I did a few environmental stories before, but my first big environmental story was probably about 10 years ago, a big investigation for the nation. And that was about a cancer cluster, and it kind of really made me dig into some of the difficulties in environmental reporting, like why it is so complicated to map exposures to outcomes, and how kind of um, the agencies, government agencies that have anything to do with it, sort of make it even harder. And just also getting close in the case of this one story that was for the nation, it was about a community in Florida that had experienced a large number of pediatric brain cancer cases. And even before you got to the lawsuit, which was against a defense contractor, there were all these divisions in the community that was experiencing them. People who were afraid about their property values decreasing, and just people who had like all these different worries and ended up fighting each other instead of the problem that they were all kind of dealing with together, or could have been dealing with together.
Yeah, I want to take a little bit of a step back because I'm still thinking about what it must have felt like to have your career begin in the midst of the AIDS crisis, working for a gay men's health advocacy organization.
Yeah.
And so much was not being told about the AIDS crisis at that time. Like, what were you up against when you thought about the small stories you were telling versus the mainstream media's narrative about what was happening to this community?
Well, I mean, it was a devastating and terrifying time. I just remember having all these dreams. You would go to work, and there were just funerals like every week, and you'd see people like get sicker and thinner and like just not show up to work and die. It was really quite a like scary and terrible thing to see. Um, on the side, it was there were a lot of victims of activism. I'm sorry, let me say that again. There were a lot of victories of activism. You could see actually how organized activists managed to change things fairly quickly. It did not feel fast enough to anybody back then, and it wasn't fast enough to the many people, for a lot of people who died. But you could see how thinking changed and how there was this lag, right, where people were, for well, there was all this homophobia and racism and reason. You could see why the public at large was like slow to acknowledge this health problem and acknowledge that it was like a problem for all of us and not just some little faction of some population they could cut off and dispense with. um, but but it was really there was so much work going on at the time, so much good work, people like fighting like hell, fighting for their lives, and within the space of several years, you saw change, and that was pretty exciting too. To see language was changing, how you talked about these things, attitudes towards gay people were changing. It was just it was kind of an amazing time, in terrible ways mostly, but also some uh, exciting ones.
Did you feel like the storytelling in independent media played a role in that narrative shift?
Well, there was so clearly a gap between. I mean, in short, yes, but you could see that the things that I was seeing, even just from my own little vantage point, were not out there, and so it was clear. It's clear there was a big gap, and lots of room for telling people's stories. Yeah.
What was the first story you ever wrote where you felt like you made a difference like that, where you shifted a narrative, where you helped change the conversation, where you brought to light a set of facts or a set of stories?
Well, gosh, I'm not ever really sure when that happens. It's hard for me to tell, and sometimes I hear years afterwards, but it's hard to tell from like behind the desk or whatever you want to call it. When you're writing, it's like, who knows what actually shifts things. I mean, you can tell now. You can tell, oh, it was retweeted however many times, or it got this many reads. But it's funny because some of the stories that seem to sink like a stone, like nobody reads them, then you hear that they changed the policy, or they like sometimes those actually do important things, and it's actually really hard to track and not obvious, at least to me.
Mm.
Sorry, I don't have a more
But you don't
satisfying.
have one, you don't have something where you feel like that help. Well, because again, we're really curious what keeps people in this work. I can
Right.
imagine being an investigative journalist on the issues that you've been investigating isn't always rewarding. So why
Yeah.
do you stay in it? And like, why do you think it's important to our country that people, or our not just our country, to our planet, that people understand the role of independent media?
Well, I mean, let's start with the story. The first stories I did for the Intercept were a three-part series in 2015. That The first one was called DuPont and the Chemistry of Deception, and the three parts together were called the Teflon Toxin. Um, and it was a very long series. I think, I don't know really how many words, probably like 15,000 words for three pieces, which people outside of journalism won't necessarily know what that means. But what I can tell you is that there are very few publications that are going to run that length of anything about, well, really about anything. But in this case, I was coming to them with a story about a chemical nobody had heard of, really. PFOA had been covered a little bit. It was sometimes called C8. There was a little bit that had been done in the Times a few years earlier. There was this lawsuit that had been bubbling along in West Virginia for a few years, and there was some local coverage. But um, the first thing was to find a publication that felt that it warranted that kind of attention. And it takes, I mean, that just to get, before I wrote anything, I had spent months like researching it. So you have to, unless if you're going to keep eating, either you're supporting yourself with something else, with some other kind of work, or you're independently wealthy. In my case, I actually had a grant from what was then called the Fund for Investigative Journalism. Is that what it was called? I might have to double check that.
We can update it in the show notes if we find
Yeah,
the better name.
yeah. How strange. It's now type investigation. Um, anyway, and so like that in itself was really important to have a grant from someone who was like, okay, this is not a complete waste of your time spending, weeks and weeks and weeks and then months and months researching this thing, which at the time I didn't really have even anyone to publish it. So when the Intercept came along, or when I kind of intersected with the Intercept, and I should say that Betsy Reed, who was then the editor in chief, had been my editor at the Nation years before. But it's, you feel the difference, right? I felt the difference because I went to them with, again, this absurdly long thing, and it was an enthusiastic yes. It was, let's do this thing. And then after I finished it, and had done these three very long, in-depth stories, they came back to me, and that's really how I came to work there. Is they said, "Well, how about you continue to follow this story for us?" And that series became. It now is called Bad Chemistry, and there are 50 stories in there that go into absurd, some would say absurd depth, but like, and at the time as I was writing them, each one seemed, I think, could have, to people outside this particular publication and other publications, perhaps overkill or too specific or too wonky or whatever. You could criticize it from any number of angles, but it ended up mattering, I think. And like, one of the things I covered in 2015, again 7 years ago now, which is crazy, is it was the first to write about firefighting foam and the fact that it contained these chemicals that we now call PFAS, and that contamination had spread into water, and that it was the military that had used this firefighting foam, and that there were sites around the country where it was already an environmental problem. And when I called the Department of Defense, as one does when you're writing about them, and I said, "Listen, I'm writing about AFFF, aqueous film forming foam. It contains PFOA, among other chemicals in this class." They didn't have any idea what I was talking about. Like, none. Had never heard any of those terms. They came to know those terms very well. I can tell you that the DoD communications person now knows very well what AFFF is, because it became something that many, many reporters wrote about around the country and around the world. Um, so it's only looking back on that you can feel the impact, right? Like, at the time, I'd be like, well, I'm in a rabbit hole and it's dark.
How did you get interested in firefighting foam? Like, tell us a little bit of, in my mind, you get a tip and
Oh yeah.
it starts your curiosity a buzzing.
Well, the way I began writing about PFOA initially was actually about New Jersey. It was a story, that initial story was, I thought, going to be about New Jersey, and at the time Chris Christie was governor, and there was this little committee that was part of the state government that was tasked with coming up with the exact amount of a water pollutant that could be the like sort of maximum amount that should be allowable in water in New Jersey, right? And could be safe. And when they'd been doing this work for a long time, and when they began looking into PFOA and trying to find the safe level, very specific, the amount that would cause no more than one cancer in a million water drinkers over a lifetime, I think is their definition. And when they were in the midst of doing this, and again, really like not not a group that had attracted much attention in the past. And I went to their one of their meetings, and it's like, low hanging ceiling tiles and pocket protectors, and like boring. And but as they continued holding their meetings, um, lawyers began to show up in the meetings, and as some of the scientists described them to me, they were like wearing really nice shoes and really nice suits. And it soon became clear that they worked for DuPont and they cared a lot about this number. And so as they were in the midst of doing this work, um, they were shut down. The plug was pulled on this Drinking Water Quality Commission, which is what it was called, and they ceased to function. Actually, it turned out for years. So the process they were in of setting the PFOA water limit was interrupted. And so that was the tip that I had gotten, and it was from an activist in New Jersey. And so as I was looking into this, I it be someone else, and I can't remember who. Anyway, it became clear to me that this chemical that they're talking about in New Jersey, PFOA, was the same chemical that was the subject of a lawsuit in West Virginia, which in that case they called it C8. It's the same chemical, and it's like C for eight carbons, C8, and they're all fluorinated. Anyway, so then I realized, oh, these are the same things. And these are two DuPont plants. One is in New Jersey, one is in West Virginia. And they basically are having the same problem that played out in different ways because of the differences in state law, and because in West Virginia, the attorney who was overseeing the class action suit, this man named Rob Willott, he got lucky, except he also worked his tail off and was industrious and creative, and managed to kind of get this litigation going that enabled them to do research with some of the money they were getting as an award from DuPont for the contamination. And with that research, they showed that there were health effects that were associated with C8 PFOA, and they wouldn't have figured that out before. And it just sort of opened the door to where we are now in a really important way. And so, but it was like it was really making the connection between those two cases that was like the aha.
And so, what's the process like for you? I mean, what does investigative journalism typically entail when you're dealing with an industry, the chemical industry, that works very hard to intimidate communities into silence and create a regulatory climate where their executives revolve into roles as regulators? So there's this kind of like dominant sense that the bad actors are policing themselves.
Well, I mean, luckily, there are also, in addition to those people, there are lots of other people. And so, you were saying, how do I get these stories, and do I get tips? I absolutely do get tips. And, in reporting the DuPont stories, I probably talked to like and easily dozens and dozens of people. I don't know the number, 40, 50, something. And everyone has some bit of information to share that illuminates, so I'm coming into it blind, really, or ignorant. It's like, what is going on in New Jersey? And you're trying to figure it out. And then you're like, whoa, what's happening in West Virginia? And you're trying to, and then I talked to Rob Bilott on the phone, and then
Who's
I
that?
figured
Oh,
Rob
the
Bilott's the
attorney.
attorney I mentioned, and he had gotten all these documents about DuPont through the disclosure process, the discovery process, excuse me, and a lot of them were public, and I got to read through them, and it's this sort of and documents that those are like between the documents and the people, you really have um, then you get a story to tell, and it's like so it's I mean it's not like magic, it's not like, oh, I have really some special skills. It's like I have the interest in it, and I have take the time to like talk to people and read, and like it's really about the time, and this being like your job, like. And of course at the time, I was not on staff at the Intercept at the time, so to a degree it was my self-appointed job. But like, so perhaps you could say why, but it's like, I think it's just super interesting is what interested me, and I felt like, and when you don't always get a good story. It's like you're curious, and it's like, oh, okay, that's your answer, and it's not that interesting. But
Mm.
like sometimes it really is, and sometimes, and once you kind of begin to understand it well enough, you can convey to other people what you think is so interesting about it.
So, what
So,
is the status of that particular case or that particular issue in West Virginia and New Jersey?
well, in West Virginia, that lawsuit is pretty well done, right? They had a number of plaintiffs, thousands, and they ended up getting a settlement. And they did a couple of test cases to begin with, and actually, I should double check, and maybe we can. I'm not sure what the final numbers are, but like DuPont spent, I believe it's more than $1 billion settling that litigation. Since that happened, DuPont spun off part of its company into another company called Chemours that basically had the perfluorinated chemicals, and then merged right with Dow to become Corteva, and it's like a whole other thing now. So, but the litigation around perfluorinated chemicals, around PFAS, I mean, it continues hugely around the country today. It's just there are many branches of it. There's a lot of litigation around the firefighting foam now, and that is, something that's happened since those first stories came out. And there's been a recognition that there is contamination around the country and around the world. I mean, I don't know that we have good numbers or can possibly come up with the good numbers for the extent of contamination. The environmental working group has a really good map that they update that shows known areas of elevated PFAS, and the EPA kind of recently changed their numbers, their threshold for acceptable water levels, to be so low for certain PFAS that they're basically below the limit of detection, which means that it kind of makes the official number of contaminated places go through the roof.
Wow. And what's the impact of contamination?
Well, I mean,
Like, were you
so
seeing birth defects, cancer clusters?
so the can the chemicals have been linked to a really large number of health effects, um, obesity, uh, higher lipid levels, kidney cancer, testicular cancer, all sorts of hormonal changes because they're endocrine disrupting,
Got it.
chemicals, immunity. So the tricky thing is that what we can say with some certainty is that these exposures, for certain of them, will elevate your chances of some of these outcomes, right? But then if I've been exposed to PFOA, I developed kidney cancer, I can't say that that is definitively why. It's very hard, right? Because you don't know why, so it's one of those things uh, that it's really hard to prove. There have definitely been a number of studies that show elevations of certain levels, of some of these health outcomes.
So, just to review, what I'm hearing from you is that there's a couple like critical ingredients to successful investigative journalism. One is the funding, so that you can take the time and the space to deep dive. Two is a publication that will support you in doing that, maybe monetarily, but also just giving you the page, so to speak, or in the internet, the scroll, so that you can
Hmm.
tell the full and comprehensive story. Um,
Yeah, and it's important to put out a publication isn't just me writing it, and there are all these steps that go into it that most people don't think, like editing, like art, like lawyering, which in this kind of story becomes really important, so making sure that you're not going to be sued, and which is kind of more than just knowing that you're telling the truth. There are all these standards. You have to just be really, really careful, and it's important to have another set of eyes or many sets of eyes looking at it, and making sure that you're okay.
well, so I want to talk about that because it feels like, in my experience, and I led, along with many other community members, a movement in the state of Hawaii to better regulate the pesticides associated with GE crop field trials. And I immediately faced both personal and sort of backlash from the industry and their representatives. And so I'm wondering, like, what it feels like for you as an individual, as a woman, working on issues that have on the other side of them unlimited corporate dollars, unlimited corporate lawyers, and just this level of scrutiny that almost makes the truth feel impossible to tell sometimes.
Yeah, I mean, I people tend to think that I would be harassed a lot, and I mean, I want to knock on my wood table when I say this. Like, I've been okay, I've been okay, and I am super careful. Obviously, it's like my job to tell the truth, So I'm starting there, and then I'm super careful beyond that to in terms of multiple sourcing and really making sure that I'm always right about you know before I put anything in print. um I mean, I would say, I'm aware that I'm a thorn in the side of some of the corporations I write about, but for the most part, we keep it cordial and polite, and with DuPont and Chemours and Dow and Corteva and Syngenta and the
My old buddies.
yeah, I mean, I would say the one company that is slightly less than friendly has been Chevron. Um, but like all of them, it is, I would say that if they're grousing about me, it's usually not to me. Sometimes I've read like sort of attacking blogs about pieces that are, especially when I write about pesticides. Some people tend to take issue with that, but it doesn't feel personal to me, and I I don't know. I'm not sweating it. really.
Yeah, I'm like another necessary ingredient feels like good journalist constitution. um
I mean, I worry about getting things wrong. And, that's what will keep me up at night. Like if I make a mistake and where I'm afraid that I maybe have made a mistake, that's the thing will wake me up at 4 in the morning and I double check and that kind of thing. But it's not so much what they're thinking about me.
So tell me a little bit about the work that you've done around sort of investigating the EPA. I mean, I hear the stories and would love to hear more about investigating these massive profit-oriented chemical companies. But for some people listening to this podcast, they might not realize that another set of problems emerges from the failure of our regulatory bodies to do their job. So I'm wondering if you can tell me a little bit about that work and sort of how it started for you and how it's going.
Yeah, well, I have been writing about the EPA for some years now, and it's always best to talk to people who work in the agency. It's just difficult to do, and it became particularly difficult when Trump became elected, right? And I remember right after the election, what was that? I was covering. There was a big climate conference that was scheduled, and I just remember going to it and trying to just talk to anybody who was, on staff at EPA. And they just were terrified, and they were terrified. They were rightly terrified. It turned out it was a really terrible 4 years there. But I remember I had recently been in China reporting on uh, perfluorinated chemicals and had been struck by how difficult it was for the scientists to speak publicly and to speak to me. And it was like a form of torture for me to ask questions because it really can, open them up to all sorts of suffering to speak publicly. And I just was reminded of that. Like it felt a little bit like China, like suddenly like, oh my God, like I can't say what's going on. And of course some of those stories dribbled out eventually during that period as people left the agency and spoke. And I was lucky and was able to talk to some of the people as they left. And then, I mean, I guess maybe my first big piece that really relied on people inside the agency. There was a big expose about the Office of Pesticide Programs, which is a division of EPA. And I spoke to dozens of people for that story. I can't remember how many of them were on staff at EPA, but many, many of them. And it was incredibly helpful, and it also took a really long time. But just to hear what they had been going through, some of them use their names. Mostly people who had left the agency already. Some who were working inside it did not use their names. But there's really nothing like hearing it directly from the people who work there. And that piece was sort of a roundup of, so to speak, of different issues that were faced within that division. Looking at different classes of pesticides and kind of all the different problems and scandals that maybe like 8 or 9 kind of different major problems that had occurred in that division.
And so tell us about some of those chemicals and like what you learned was happening.
Well, I mean, one of the things I heard a lot about was how industry kind of influences that particular division. So that, things about the presence of lobbyists, the presence of industry folks, even when you walk into the building, how well acquainted they are with the people who are working on their own products, how they're always offering help in a very kind of kind way, but there's this sense of you're being kind of watched, or the people who are working on these things are being watched. And I was told that industry folks are super friendly and helpful unless you piss them off, in which case they'll try to get rid of you, try to go above you and get you ousted, kind of a thing. I heard that repeatedly. um, I heard about a kind of small error, I guess, that was made in a study that was funded by Dow, on chlorpyrifos, that years and years ago, and how that ended up um, changing the decades of EPA policy, and that's sort of how the story begins. I also learned about glyphosate, the active ingredient in Roundup, which has been the subject of debate about its relationship to non-Hodgkin's lymphoma, the cancer. And in that piece, I published a document that showed that there was actually disagreement within the agency about that relationship, even though the EPA had re-registered glyphosate. It turned out that some within the Office of Research and Development had looked at the same research that OPP had used to say that it was fine, and had found that actually there was a relationship between non-Hodgkin's lymphoma and glyphosate exposure. Anyway, it's a really long piece, but there are a lot of, and it I would say probably tries the patience of readers in just being really detailed, but it did show kind of a pattern where you really have this incredibly powerful, wealthy industry that is better resourced than the agency that is regulating it. And so it was kind of learning about how that power is exerted. And one of the things I showed was I looked at all the directors of OPP going back decades, and I wish I can remember when it was. Was it from the 70s or from the early 80s? Every single one of the directors went on to work for industry after leaving EPA. If they continued to work, there was maybe one or two that just retired and went straight to retirement. Everyone else, in one way or another, ended up working for industry. Of course, working for industry is far more lucrative than working for the government. And how do you set yourself up to get one of these jobs? Like, well, you don't do it by pissing them off. So the way some people described it to me is that it kind of trickles down this sense of, sure, on the top levels, you're going to end up going to work for the industry that you were regulating. But like, to climb the ranks within the agency, there's this sense of like the people who are succeeding are the ones that are basically in some way acceptable, or even preferable to industry.
Have you ever felt like your stories don't have legs because the very same industries that you're writing about are also in bed with the larger media platforms that should be telling these stories with you?
I mean, again, it's really hard to figure out, for me to figure out, why some stories have legs, so to speak, and why others don't. So there's that. But then, like with the chlorpyrifos, like I I wrote about the Trump, the when just right before, no, right after Trump got elected, maybe before he even, I don't, it was after he got elected, I wrote about the chlorpyrifos problem. And I had been in the middle, strangely, of a big feature about chlorpyrifos at the time, and I had thought I was going to call it The Last Days of Chlorpyrifos, but then, as you may recall, we didn't expect Trump to get elected. When he did, it was um, I was like, oh man, I see what could happen here. And so And so, and in fact, what could happen, which is that the EPA would reverse the planned ban on chlorpyrifos, it did in fact happen. And tons of big media wrote about that. It was after we wrote about it, but they did get to the story. And so, some of these things they do get covered and some don't. But so I'm not answering your question. Are they, feeling like they're in bed? Why do some stories, I mean, people will say sometimes they're too far out, right? But then, yeah, I mean, for instance, I mean, the another story that kind of took off, but then I think there was a lot of fear from mainstream media about this story was about Stephen Donziger, the attorney who is working in Ecuador to fight the pollution with a big case against Chevron. And basically, the Ecuadorian court decided, gave a big judgment to Chevron, billions of dollars. Chevron refused to pay it, and not only did they refuse to pay it, they went after Stephen Donziger, who is the attorney who basically helped, get that judgment. And it is a complicated story. I would be the first to say that. And Stephen Donziger is not a perfect person. However, it really seemed to me like a very clear example of like a massive oil company using its might to make an example of a human rights attorney, right? And so I wrote about it when he was actually put on house arrest, was on house arrest for a long time for what was essentially misdemeanor. And that seemed just crazy to me. Like you have a human rights attorney who is fighting for over environmental contamination on behalf of poor people in Ecuador, who wins a judgment, and the giant company that is supposed to pay the judgment turns around and smushes him like a fly. And they did. They really and it was clear they made very little secret of the fact that they were out to get him and that they were kind of making an example of him. And I think that that's scary. That story was scary to many media outlets because you have a litigious company that is like you've just seen them stop at nothing to destroy a person. So, you know, I I think that was a scary one to cover, and I think that the those I do think are the reasons that some of the bigger outlets don't touch it.
I'm wondering how it felt for you as a journalist during the Trump administration to like watch the media become a target of the president and to really see the attack on journalists like we did. Of course, that's been happening, but it sort of accelerated under the Trump administration.
Yeah, I mean, I don't. The thing is, writing for a place like the Intercept, you really never feel like the whole idea of access journalism when you're. Can you hang on one half a second?
Yeah,
Actually,
yeah,
I'm
yeah.
just.
I'm going to fix my lighting too.
All right, hang on a sec. Hello, hello. Hi, I'm good. Can I call you back in a few, like at around 4:30? Yeah. What's the best number? 916 4.
I'm going to grab some water, Sharon.
Okay, great. Okay, I'll call you at 4:30. Okay, thanks. Bye. Okay.
Hi, Sharon. I didn't introduce myself, but I'm Julia. I'm the producer. I was emailing with you.
Hi, Julia. How you doing?
I'm good. How are you?
Good.
Thanks for being with us today. I love everything you've written, so
Oh,
it's very cool to just get to know you more intimately.
thank you. That's so nice of you to say. And actually, when um, When Ashley comes back, there's something I should say to both of you. Um, are you in Hawaii? No,
No, I'm in DC. Excuse the
that's fun.
many EMT cars that go by.
Oh man. So Ashley, oh, she's gone.
Yeah, hold on. I'm just gonna fix this lit. We're getting your rain up here or down here. So it's like the lights
Mm.
shifting a lot outside.
Yeah, yeah. So I was just realizing I should tell you this. I meant to tell you this before. But so I am going to be leaving the Intercept probably by the time this comes out. I will not be at the Intercept. I'm gonna start working for ProPublica.
Okay.
But we haven't made that announcement yet. And I did tell my editor, both editors, my old editor and my new editor, about it. And they were just like, just say it's about your work at the Intercept. I mean, and also I'll be doing similar work at ProPublica. I assume it doesn't matter, right? Does it matter?
I don't think so. I mean,
Yeah.
we'll include where people can find you. So we'll
Yeah.
include both a link to the Intercept and ProPublica if that's where you are when this
Yeah.
comes out.
I'll be working, I'll be starting at September 12th.
Okay. Yeah, I think you're right. We're going to launch the podcast and there will be like a teaser about you, but it'll come out probably towards the end of the season.
Okay. So, yeah. So I think you can just say, an investigative journalist who worked for the Intercept for 7 years and is now at ProPublica, right?
So, Hawaii has a big Omidyar funded media outlet, Civil
Mm.
Beat, and it
Mm-hmm.
was, again, really critical to my activism. So I have like I feel like kindred spirits with the Intercept.
Yeah, and it's been a very, very wonderful place. For a lot of reasons, it's been a great place. And then I don't know, it was an offer I couldn't refuse, so I didn't refuse it.
Good for you. I
Hmm.
like to hear stories of women getting offers they can't refuse.
It's like, and I've been at the Intercept for 7 years and it's been super good. And I'm going to a place where they have a lot of environmental journalists and a lot of like editors who are going to be like, what about this? What about that? Check, check. Like the idea is like maybe they'll like, get me to work even harder, which is probably good.
Hmm. Yeah, and being in community feels good. I mean, just with colleagues that
Yeah,
know
I
what you
mean,
do.
yeah, and I love what the Intercept does, but nobody there does what I do. So it might be good to have people who can say, "Wait a minute, did you check the like I don't know, whatever." Like
Yeah,
who's really
totally.
versed in all the like environmental stuff, so I'm not always out on my own.
So we were talking about Trump and like
Oh yeah.
journalism under the Trump era. So to
Okay.
repeat the question, like I'm wondering what it felt like for you when the president started to target media.
Yeah, I mean, it was so extreme, right? What Trump was doing was so extreme. But I had never fancied myself a friend of any administration. I wasn't going to the White House press conferences for anyone, So I guess I sort of, you know, I don't cover daily journalism, daily news in the same way, but it kind of serves me in a way to not think of myself as friendly with anyone, kind of anyone, period, but certainly the administration, I mean, um, because that's like whatever they're telling you, even if you are friendly, you have to like check it out, right? And so it just made it super clear. Like, I mean, with Trump, it was already super clear that not just you had to check it out, but that a lot of what was coming out of his mouth was false and like pointedly lies, especially on the environmental stuff, was like self-serving terrible, you know, bull. So I mean, it just made it all the more clear. Like, obviously, you have to dive in here, and you know, in the Trump EPA, pretty much 201, all the folks who were put in charge of the divisions were really representatives of the industry that they were regulating. So it was like turning the whole enterprise on its head. It wasn't the first time that it happened at EPA, but it was really extreme. And it was really upsetting, you know, to see like Myron Ebell, who's like a nut, really, who like went in there to seriously. I mean, he, you know, was one of the people who has just spouted all sorts of nonsense about, you know, how the planet is also already cooling, it's cooling instead of warming, and all this just kind of silliness, you know, being put in charge of the transition at EPA. It was like, what is happening, you know? And so it just was upside down land. I always thought of it as like upside down land. Like, it just like none of it is going to function the way it's supposed to function.
Do you feel that functionality has been restored under Biden, or are you still watching the legacies of Trump's chaos inside the agency?
Certainly, to some degree, it has improved. To a large degree, it has improved. I mean, and it like is not a small matter that he has spoken a lot about being committed to science and letting science lead the way and all this, right? But I would say the Whistleblowers series I have worked on is, you know, testament to the fact that we're not all the way there, and there is still lingering problems that don't necessarily come from political appointees, i.e., who the presidents and their folks put in there, but often from lifetime career employees at the EPA. And as discussed, you know, there are other ways for industry to influence. It's not just about who you put, you know, in charge of the EPA, but also, you know, the kind of ongoing daily interactions between regulators and industry.
To switch gears a little bit, like knowing that you started your career writing about the AIDS crisis, I'm wondering a little bit about your reporting around COVID and what it's taught you, again, about the importance of deep, complex writing and reporting in a time where we seem to be resting on simplicity for the sake of, you know, I don't even know at this point.
Well, I mean, there have been a couple of different sort of strings of reporting I've been following. I mean, one of them has been profiteering, you know, and it's sort of the same, in a way, the same kind of reporting I've done in the chemical industry. And it's just kind of looking at the money, and, you know, and there have been a couple of satisfying occasions where you get to like point out the sort of the way that greed and profit is driving what happens instead of, you know, health concerns. So that happened when there is an orphan drug application put in for sorry, hold on one sec. I have to, it's been so long since I wrote that story. I don't want to get it wrong. Oops. Right. Right, it was Gilead, right. 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 Sorry.
No
I
worries.
just wanted to, where are you? There you are. Okay. So that happened with a company called Gilead Pharmaceutical that put in an Orphan Drug Act application for remdesivir. Orphan Drug Act is supposed to give certain protections and to make drugs profitable if they're for rare conditions, and that's defined as fewer than 200,000 cases. And the company threw that application in really quickly because it was in the early part of the pandemic, and it was before they wanted to get it in before you hit 200,000 COVID cases, and they got it, and then ended up, you know, basically saying they didn't want it because they were ashamed out of it. And also just seeing how companies that create drugs with government funding went on to sell those drugs to back to the government at a huge profit, and sort of like that kind of ineptitude and greed that is not serving the public. So that's been one sort of branch of my reporting, and the other has been working with my colleague Mara Vistendahl here, has been like following NIH funding of viral research, in particular the research that was conducted in China by the Wuhan Institute of Virology in conjunction with the EcoHealth Alliance, which is EcoHealth Alliance is a US-based research group that got grant funding through NIH and passed on part of it to the Wuhan Institute of Virology. And through FOIA, we got a lot of documents that showed that they were engaged in research that's sometimes called gain of function research, and it's a kind of research that changes how a virus behaves, and is generally the kind of stuff they were doing is thought of as dangerous, and had been previously EcoHealth Alliance and Anthony Fauci had said, oh, we're not doing that. And then on closer examination, and we talked to lots of experts in this area, it turned out actually, yes, they were doing this kind of research. And it just opened the door a little bit more into the question of how the pandemic emerged in the first place. I don't pretend to have an answer to that question, but
The lab leak theory.
yeah, but I do think it's an open question, and there's actually quite a bit of evidence pointing that way. But we don't know. We don't have enough to say. But it's been a really interesting and kind of productive line of questioning that Mara and I and a couple of other reporters at the Intercept have been pursuing, in terms of getting and interpreting documents to understand what was done, what was the level of biosafety oversight of this kind of research, which generally involves kind of could collecting and identifying potentially dangerous viruses. Whoa, it's a loud thunderclap.
Yeah, I mean, I'm watching it. It's like gray
Yeah,
and pouring here, so
kind of cool.
it must
Anyway,
be.
so it involves like looking into these potentially dangerous viruses, which the thinking behind that is that that's how you're going to prepare for and prevent the next pandemic, if you understand what's dangerous and what's out there, and then you can maybe get a vaccine against it or drugs. On the other hand, if you're collecting a bunch of potentially dangerous viruses, there's the potential danger that, one escapes, or there are lots of different ways that it could cause problems. So that's actually been a really interesting line of inquiry as well.
And so for you, again, I'm just wondering, like, you're writing about something that's so divisive and oversimplified in the mainstream media, and it's treated as like fodder for political grandstanding and division, right? Like whether or not there was a lab leak doesn't have anything to do with whether or not Trump is the rightful president or Biden is good or bad. It's completely separate. And yet, to even do that research and ask those questions, for me, feels like it puts you at risk for being reduced to someone who's a conspiracy theorist or
I know. It's like a bizarre and awful political landscape around this story. So it's been something driven in large part, it seems like, by a far right and just Republican in general hate for Anthony Fauci that I do not
yes.
share. I don't hate him as an individual. He's done lots of good things. Um, and I guess, and you're right, and I've gotten lots of crazy email, and I guess you know, I don't think this should be a partisan issue. And I guess the way to, but on the other hand, like, if, just because Trump said it was so, um, does not make it not so. Do you know what I mean? Like, just like the
Yeah,
problem
yeah,
is that
yeah.
Trump weighed in on this without having any evidence, thus, resulting in many reasonable people jumping to the other side because he has proven himself nutty and wrong about so many things. Unfortunately, it's just another case where it is the job of reporters to get at the facts, right? And so there are actually a lot of facts to get at. And I, again, don't have the answers, but what I think the way to avoid, first of all, the kind of crazy polarizing dialogue is, one, not to engage in it, and two, just to never get ahead of what you know, and like put the facts out there. There are a lot of facts to put out there. Like, for instance, the first thing we did is we got this grant application. Previously, just a summary of it had been available online. We put in a FOIA, a Freedom of Information Act request for it, did not get it, and our lawyers sued, and to our surprise and delight, produced, we got a whole bunch of documents from it, and the documents really showed, really introduced all sorts of new information to the public conversation. So, okay, we had been doing this problematic research, and even though there were safeguards in place that were supposed to mean that this kind of research got oversight, that didn't happen. And then also more documents that showed that actually within the NIH, the level of kind of awareness, knowledge of what was happening in this grant at all, but definitely within the grant to the sub-grant to the Wuhan Institute of Virology before the pandemic, was like basically zero. They had very, very little sense of what kind of biosafety precautions had been taken, and nobody was really watching this, right? Afterwards, you could see, until very recently, you see there's communications back and forth saying, oh, please, please try to provide us these documents. Well, they're not getting, for instance, lab notebooks or, biosafety documents. They're not getting those documents from China anymore because the kind of relations have broken down. But it's really instructive to know, oh, hey, we didn't really understand what was happening there. And this is potentially very dangerous research. Again, I'm not saying this is the cause of the pandemic, but it is it definitely comes with risk, right? And we're still paying for this kind of research. We're continuing to do that without, to my mind, I don't think there's been any real dramatic improvement in the oversight. So I think it appears to be an ongoing issue. But again, I think the way to avoid getting involved in the craziness is just to get new information and put it out there without anything editorially beyond describing what you found, right? So don't get ahead of the facts. All you can say is, here's this, and here's what experts in this area say it might mean, and get a range of opinion, right? Because it is so divisive that even within scientists on this really narrow topic, now you have to get like, an equal number of the lab leakers and the, natural origin people. I mean, although when it comes down to it, I don't think really you're going to find any credible scientist who says he's a lab leaker. What they're going to say is they think it's possible and should be investigated. And I feel like, it's really important to remember that like, this whole like the lab leakers are really just people saying, we think this might have happened, let's investigate it.
Yeah. So I know we're almost out of time, and I wanted to end with like just a question around sort of how you stay in this, given all the increasing barriers there are to the work that you do. We have a consolidating media landscape. We have the politicization of truth. We have agency whistleblowers that are being scared shitless to tell the truth. We have the threat of the Republican Party coming back in power, where the penalties paid for truth telling are going to get even greater. Like, how do you continue to do what you do, and how do you fortify yourself, and like what's giving you hope that it could get better?
So I have at various points in my career thought, oh, I should stop this. I should stop doing this and try to do something else. Um, and I've never succeeded. Um, and I think it's because I really deeply love it. Um, I think it's really fun, and I say that like in like it's not fun in what most people would consider fun, but I feel like given sort of who I am as a person, and and that is the kind of person who's going to wake up thinking about climate change and things, things that are upsetting, given that I'm going to engage with these issues anyway, it would be far more upsetting to me not to write about them than to write about them.
Mm.
So it's like, and it also it allows me to talk to people and meet people who are so interesting in doing all sorts of things, and they teach me about it, and it's like, I mean, it keeps feeling like the wrong word, but it's fun, like, so that part's fun. I mean, the and I'm so lucky to have had for the past couple of years publications that are committed to putting these kinds of stories out, so I'm not lacking the support. It is a terrible media landscape, that is true, and so many environmental journalists are kind of in much scarier positions, and it's only by sheer luck really that I'm not. But so that's not my problem right now. It is, I would say, kind of the danger is it does, the truth of the sort of enormity of the problems that we're facing, it does eat at my soul. But I think it eats, at a lot of people's souls. It's only makes it slightly better that I can write about it. But I think we all, or I mean, I'll just say for myself, I mean, some time in nature, some time with my kids, and some stupid books, and like I need those kinds of things to get through. But but I really just feel kind of lucky to be able to kind of engage with the things that terrify me most, and to kind of point at them. And I mean, it's like if you saw, a ghost or something. Like, wouldn't you want to go get someone and point at it and say, I saw a ghost? Like, it's like that. It's like, okay, so I think I see something really terrible. I have to tell you all about it. And, like, it's just amazing to me that anyone ever wants to read it. But, you know.
Yeah, not only do we want to read it, we need it. I mean, something that's emerged for me now, 15 episodes into this podcast, is like there are some essential ingredients to social change. And
Hmm.
deep thought and research and writing are one of the essential ingredients, along with litigators and lawyers and people that
Yeah.
are willing to test the law, and truth tellers, both inside agencies. And so I just really appreciate, the work that you do and the stories that you're telling, and know that it's not just surprising that people read it. We need it. Because I'm not going to do that work. Um, I don't have the attention span. Um, but I'm so grateful it's being done, and I can hit the ground running once the information is there.
Oh, that's nice. Right. I feel like we all have our place, right? We all have our place. And I
Yep.
think, for me, it's like, I don't mind. I don't getting the way I always think of it is like I don't mind getting dirty. So I like when I was a kid I liked to play in the mud. It's like I don't like whatever. So I feel like I can do that, and then you all can do what you do, and then
And in the end, God let us save this planet from the forces that are spinning it to its own overbaking.
Yeah. Yeah.
We had a really good episode. I'll end on a high note with a activist, a meditation teacher, Mark Coleman. Do you know his work?
Mm-mm.
He has a website and a set of programs called Awake in the Wild. It'll go search it up. It'll be very nourishing. He does outdoor nature-based meditation. But we sort of got at that like in all of this work that's so tiring at a desk behind a computer, like we have to remember to feed our souls and like stay in touch literally with the planet that we're trying to save.
Right.
So I
Yeah.
appreciate your recommendation to get outside and be with your kids. And I know you have somewhere to go soon, so thank you.
Well, thank you. I really enjoyed being on it. I hope I didn't get anything wrong. I don't
I wouldn't
know.
worry too much. We can send you the episode if you just want to
Yeah.
fact check yourself, and
At the
then
end, will you do that? Because, and I'll send you my, you know what, let me just do it. Right now, I'm going to give you my personal email because, and then I'll be at ProPublica um, after September 12th.
congratulations.
Thank you. I mean, it'll be fun, you know.
Okay, got it.
It'll be interesting, a new thing.
All right, well, we'll follow you there.
Cool. All right.
All
Well,
right,
good to
thanks,
talk with
Sharon.
you.
Yep, yep,
Thank you.
yep. Have a
Thanks,
great one.
Sharon.
Okay,
Bye.
my pleasure. Bye.